Welcome everyone. I am so excited to see everyone attending our second event here at STEM at STIC. I am Barbara Washburn, the Dean of STEM, and as a fellow female engineer, I am so ecstatic that several people are tuning in this week to explore and learn more ways of really how STEM really is in our whole world here. So I have the pleasure to introduce our Lieutenant Governor Polito, who has excitingly graced us with appearing today and helping kick off the, more importantly, avenue that all women, minorities, and males should have, and that is a career in STEM.
Well, thank you, Dean Washburn. It's a real honor to be here with all of you. I obviously think fondly of the work that you do at STIC, being an integral partner of ours in Western Mass to help people develop needed skills for our innovation economy. And as I was sharing with you in the time before coming live here to the group, the experiential learning that you embrace at STIC informed our administration early on around the need to have that kind of programming at our vocational career technical schools, our community colleges, and across the Commonwealth. And we ended up developing a capital program that invested in classrooms the kind of equipment that you have available at STIC, like 3NC machines, 3D printers, all those fun things that are really important to experiential learning. And before the pandemic hit, we were going all around the Commonwealth, the governor and me and our team, showcasing this opportunity to develop our workforce for the innovation economy. And it gives me great pleasure to be with all of you to talk about an important issue, but also during STEM Week to highlight the importance of STEM in the time in which we all lived through in a pandemic. We have seen the value of STEM skills and abilities throughout this whole response. When we think early on of the healthcare system and the emergency responders, our nurses and doctors and everyone, and what they were willing to do and able to do to help people recover. Think about all the materials that they needed in order to protect themselves, and how we asked manufacturers all across our Commonwealth if they could make our own PPE, because we were struggling a great deal securing PPE for the front line from other places around the world. As we said, why can't we make it here in the Commonwealth on our own? And manufacturers started making gowns and gloves and face coverings and ventilators and everything. So very exciting. And then as we speak, scientists are in laboratories researching and testing and trying different ways to treat COVID-19 and ultimately be the ones that secure a vaccine that can be distributed wide scale to help people permanently respond to COVID-19. And every piece of that is a STEM piece, whether it's a skill, an ability, or critically thinking or problem solving. And these are clearly all the things that you embrace at STIC. I see Northeastern is a partner here and have helped us all. I also want to acknowledge the issue of food security. That during the pandemic, while we think about how we're responding, we're also looking at issues that are very much a part of our society, but became more pronounced and even more of a challenge to us during the pandemic. And food insecurity was obviously one of those things. And so what we were able to do was work with our municipal partners to figure out how we can use our food providers, our food pantries, our food banks, to package food in a more simple way so that they could easily be distributed through, say, a family box, balanced with nutrition that could be sent out through distribution channels to help families in need. And we ramped up that process in a relatively short period of time and reached a lot of people. But we took it one step further and we said, much like we did with the PPE and asking manufacturers to make it, we have asked local food developers to think about how they could be part of the food distribution supply chain to help address food insecurity. So you think about our farmers and our fishermen. You think about small businesses that are in the packaging or refrigeration or freezing business. You think about the sort of the new ways that some of these businesses have to work together to combine locally sourced foods with a production and a distribution channel that can then be distributed right here in our Commonwealth to people in our communities that need a little help. So that was one of the innovations that came out of addressing food insecurity, but developing a more permanent food development and packaging and distribution channel that can help businesses in this pandemic and also help people in need get locally sourced fresh foods of our Commonwealth. So that's a good news story that we certainly will take lessons from and learn from that and do more of in the future. But I think it allows me the opportunity just to say, we're a Commonwealth filled with innovation, filled with talent, and filled with dedicated people, whether you're a public servant, or you're someone that works hard in your community, or you're a mom and dad, or you're a family-owned business, wherever you are. I'm just really proud, as is the governor, of what people have been willing to do and how hard they're working through this, as hard as it is and as frustrated as people get, and as fatigued as people get with the rules and restrictions that we're all living with. I think we just need to find in each other the source of strength and resiliency needed to go the distance and come out of this thing better and stronger from it. And it's just because of who we are. So I just wanted to utilize this time in STEM Week to kind of reinforce that we're a smart and strong Commonwealth filled with a lot of people who care and a lot of great talent from one end of the spectrum to the other. So just thank you for a few minutes to be with you. I look forward to learning more about how you're addressing this important issue. And I'll turn it back over to Dean Washburn. And I think that President Cook is on too. And I was saying how much, President Cook, we value the work that you've done at STIC and how much you helped our administration develop a workforce development initiative that was really based upon something we learned from your work at STIC. And thank you for your leadership in Western Mass. You have a phenomenal team there, and I look forward to hearing your words this afternoon as well.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Thank you, Dean Washburn. This is a treat, Lieutenant Governor, to have you join us. You are such a champion and advocate for all things STEM, not just the STEM Week, which has really become signature in the Commonwealth. Thrilled that you can join us. I understand we may have you for some of the other events this week, and again, a real treat for us. To those joining us today, thank you. Obviously, as the technical community college in the Commonwealth, this is a very important topic for us. Even just a testament to being flexible, if you will, to do a STEM week virtually. I'm thrilled. I look at our team right here, to our dean, to Dr. Felicia Griffin-Fennell, to Dr. Staggers-Hakim, to Dr. Carrera. Thank you so much to Becky Berkey and Ibrahim Ali. Thank you for joining us on this really important topic. You know, sourcing our food and having conversations around food security and insecurity is tremendously valuable, I know, to our employees, our institution, and to our students. So I too want to just offer a warm welcome, and I appreciate underneath all that, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Professor Rena Randier, who I know is a real champion of things down the road, like our STEM Starter Academy. Really important topic. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And again, I'll step to the side now, too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. As we mentioned, today is a really great day to be able to explore issues pertaining to our food. It's such a vital part of our lives. And given what's happening in the world right now, it's really helped us figure out how important and how vital and how interconnected it is to our existence and our livelihoods, and how it's connected to all facets of our lives. Before we move into the panel presentation, I just wanted to give thanks to Vanetta Lightfoot, Multicultural Affairs, and Dr. Josh Guerrera of Urban Studies for the collaboration on this event. For our panel discussion entitled Know Where Your Food Comes From, our panelists are Ibrahim Ali, Director of Agriculture and Youth Programs of Gardening the Community, Dr. Becca Berkey, Director of Service Learning at Northeastern University, and STCC's own Dr. Raja Stagger, Assistant Professor of Sociology. Today's panelists will talk about why it is important for all of us to know about the food that we put into our bodies. Knowing the ways in which we all get access to food based on geographical and other factors goes a long way to understanding how our bodies respond to what they consume. The different kinds of foods there are can have a significant impact on our physiological health, our psychological well-being, and our longevity. They also will explore ways in which food access and production have impact on other factors, including the global pandemic and long-term sustainability. After this panel discussion, we will open up the dialogue for questions. So please welcome me our panelists with a thumbs up. So let's begin with each of you introducing yourselves and giving us your connections to understanding about food production and access. Anyone can start.
Okay, I'll jump in there. And I think that are you guys hearing me okay?
There's a little bit of feedback.
Okay. No?
Speak now.
Okay, is that a little better?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So the headphones are not working. All right, so I will kind of start with my experience, probably a little, less traditional than probably Becca and Ibrahim in terms of your work. I'm a sociologist, as you mentioned, Felicia, and I'm specifically a medical sociologist. In the kind of sociology work that I'm most interested in around medical and health actually looks at social determinants of health. So really social factors as drivers of health conditions. So we have to consider social economic outcomes. We have to consider other community factors. We have to consider the built environment, differences in terms of what neighborhoods have access to, in terms of resources that are drivers of health. Food is also considered a social determinant of health. And when we consider access to food and food as part of the built environment, whether or not communities have substantial access to grocery stores or other sources of substantial and quality food production is critical to health outcomes. So I am interested in health inequities broadly. So if we're talking about diabetes, if we're talking about cancer inequities, if we're talking about obesity, for example, and other cancers and the prevalence in communities of color. That conversation is not complete without considering the importance of food and access to food and different access to food that communities have based on income, based on race. So it's critical to this conversation before we can even get into those other those health outcomes that we would study that I would study as a medical sociologist. We have to consider those foundational factors, and food is so critical to that.
Either Becca or Ibrahim.
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, thank you for having me in this panel. This is always a timely conversation to talk about food because I love to eat. I'm like most of y'all. So, our rationale around food production and food access kind of stems from a lot of what my sister just spoke about. And I think that, for us, we're directly in the soil. And so the soil is our first point of kind of figuring out what we would like to see come out of it. And more importantly, how we're going to feed the soil so that what we do get is going to be top notch. We don't think that just because we're in Six Corners Mason Square, we deserve any less quality organic produce than anyone anywhere else. And the only difference is that in our community, it's almost crucial that we also have to try to figure out a way to make it affordable. And that's where the access piece comes in. And so, we're growing a tremendous amount of food. Our program is actually a youth-based program. So it's basically young people from the neighborhood that are growing the food. So we have from 8th grade to about 12th grade, students from Springfield, from the neighborhood, all of them, that are growing food, and they're reconnecting in ways that, you just don't get by being a consumer. And they're able to articulate the methods, or we teach them to be able to articulate, the reasons why we're growing the food, and why it's so important that, and why it's unfortunate, in fact, that in 2020, a year of difficulty, without a doubt, but, there are things that were in the way of equity in food before COVID-19. There's inequity in food during COVID-19. And unless we are really on our job, that same trend will continue whenever we do get eventually to the end of, well, maybe not the end, but we see something change as far as more positive outlook on the COVID-19 stuff. So I'll leave it at there, let the next sister talk.
Thank you. Great. Well, I am so excited to be part of this conversation today with all of you. So my main role is I work at Northeastern University in Boston and oversee community engaged teaching and research, but I also teach with our human services program around food justice and community development specifically. And I kind of orient myself as an environmental sociologist, although my work is largely interdisciplinary. So my kind of pathway into this conversation actually begins as one of those people Ibrahim was just describing, who really didn't actually know much about the food system. I grew up in the Midwest and was exposed to a lot of agriculture, but a lot of, very large scale, industrial, conventional agriculture. And I moved to Florida in my early 20s. I moved to Central Florida, and it was there that I first learned about how much of the crop production in our country is actually harvested by people, and was introduced to the whole concept of farm workers. And again, by this point I had a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and really this was something that was largely invisible to me. And I think what leads me here today is my own kind of journey of discovery on figuring out why was that invisible to me as someone who was, a fairly well-educated person who, interacts with the food system as we all do each day. And so that kind of light bulb going off for me led me on this journey of first working when I was down in Florida with the Farm Worker Association of Florida in some of my work at colleges and universities at the time, and learning more about the plight of farm workers on mostly large scale conventional industrial farms in the US. And then moved to the Northeastern United States. At first I was in New Hampshire, and now I'm in Boston. And it was there that I formed a partnership through a number of different relationships that I had formed with the Northeast Organic Farming Association. And Ibrahim, I saw in your bio, which I was looking up earlier today, that you're connected to them as well. And I actually did my dissertation research years ago in partnership with NOFA, and looking at labor on small and family scale organic farms in the United States, and specifically the Northeastern United States, and looking at it from an environmental justice perspective, which you know, really centers, you know, identifying historically marginalized communities and the impacts of a lot of our decisions on it. And so looking at these communities, thinking about the plight of small and family scale farmers as marginalized within the broader political economic system that is US agriculture. So, you know, it was kind of from there that I began kind of looking at labor across the entire food system, and thinking about not just the injustices within that, but also promising approaches to coalition building, social change, and community development that really centered the voices of the people within the system, and kind of looking at broader food system. And so the connection for me between, you know, food production and food access, you know, I think really lies within this kind of connection of our food system and how deeply entrenched it is within capitalism, within neoliberalism, and just kind of our larger economic system. And I think one of the last pieces I'll share in this opening is that, you know, I think what I've found really interesting in at least what I've seen happening here in Boston and some of the work I do with the Boston Food Access Council, is that this COVID-19 disruption, and I feel like calling it a disruption kind of minimizes the impact that it's had, but it has exposed, I think, at a level of consciousness for many people, vulnerabilities that have existed within this system for a long time. And so, you know, the Lieutenant Governor was talking earlier about supply chains. You know, those begin breaking down very quickly when you have a disruption of this scale. But those vulnerabilities were always there. The people that are suffering the most were suffering within the system before. And I think that, you know, that piece to me, the interconnection between the way our economic system works, our political economic system works, and how our food system works are intractable at this point in time. And so to be able to look at things from a variety of perspectives is key to this conversation.
Thank you all so much. And Becca, you did hit up on one of the topics that we're going to discuss, so we're going to swing that over to that in a few minutes. But I wanted to start with this first question. What is the link between food production / access and physiological and psychological health? How do they play together? Anybody can just jump in, kind of letting it be loose.
Ibrahim, were you going to go? I'll jump in, and I'll start in a very broad way. In terms of, I'm actually going to speak in terms of, well, food production. I think Ibrahim and Becca probably have, and Dr. Berkey have probably more to say about that part. In terms of, you know, what's in the food. I mean, I think that will come up, but I'll speak about it from the perspective of access. We know that, and I think that people probably have a good understanding that, you know, what we eat determines our health overall. So we know that in disenfranchised communities, people don't have access to the same kinds of food, right? So they don't have access to, and let's just be concrete here. Some years ago, I was working for Harlem Children's Zone, and this is going back to probably 2008. And there was a study that was actually done, that was part of the work that I had to do for this job. And we just did an assessment in terms of what was available in terms of food access in Harlem. And when I lived in New York City, going back again, early 2000s, there was one grocery store, there was a Pathmark on the corner, and that was the only grocery store. So people truly didn't have access. And I can go back prior to that, where I lived in Washington, DC, closer to a lower income neighborhood. There were not any grocery stores. I oftentimes ask my students at STIC, you know, when we talk about social determinants of health, you know, where the grocery stores are relative to where they live. And there's a bigger piece here. Can you access the grocery store if you don't have a car? And people typically say no. They actually explained to me that there were times, and this has come up. I worked for the state of Connecticut for years. I was actually formerly the director of Commission of Health Equity, and part of that is we would have to go around the state and have these focus groups and talk to people about what their needs were. And you would think that they would talk about healthcare, and they certainly did. But the other part was, you know what, we don't have access to grocery stores. We have to take the bus. So we're taking the bus and we're carrying bags of groceries. People have told me before, though, too, that in certain cities, they put limitations on how many bags you can actually carry on a bus. So if that's the only way that people have access to food, that is a social factor and a social driver. And we know that, of course, with food, it leads to various poor health outcomes. So we cannot separate what people have access to relative to the higher rates we see of diabetes in communities of color. And to be blunt, we're talking about brown and Black people, we're talking about African Americans, people of African descent, we're talking about Latinx communities, we're talking about Indigenous Native American populations. We can't separate that from the high rates of heart disease at earlier ages that we're seeing. There are really, one of the videos I reference quite a bit, and I'll reference it here though too for resources for folks who are interested, is Unnatural Causes. I'm sure Dr. Berkey, I'm sure that others, you use this as well. And it really highlights that in terms of higher rates of diseases we're seeing in younger people, you know, in terms of just really preventable issues that should not be happening at people at very young ages. Higher rates of obesity, and the obesity part, it's not about taking up space. It's about the impact on our body system. And that seems to be an ongoing concern. And we know that it's intentional. That's the other part though too. And we have to get to that part. And I hope that in the conversation today, we do speak about that. And when I say it's avoidable and it's intentional, that's why it's unnatural, right? And we want to be able to talk about, anytime we're talking about an inequity, we can address it through a social issue. An example of this, again, from Unnatural Causes. One of the videos is actually called Bad Sugar. So Unnatural Causes, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's about a 3-hour documentary. And there are several segments that actually address different health outcomes in population groups based on class, based on race, based on location. And one video that I like to use is Bad Sugar. And it looks at the health outcomes of Native American Indigenous populations and how that we could see how that was very much shaped by a social factor. We actually saw in that video high rates of diabetes to a point that over generations, people expected that they would just get diabetes because that's what actually happened as people aged. And that's what people saw happening over time in their families. But when you dig deep into understanding, again, we're talking about root causes, and we have to go into the root causes, all right? The root cause here was that water was rerouted. Water was rerouted away from the reservation to help build golf courses and recreational facilities and opportunities for people who were privileged, okay, and wealthy. And it took away from just basic human rights and human needs for good quality, healthy food for people who are disenfranchised and marginalized. So there's a direct link to health, but we do have to, as part of this conversation too, consider, again, those root causes and how those root causes are systemic. And I speak about that because that's where the solutions are. So as we're talking about this, we're laying out the problem, the concern, you know, and I say this is too, we have folks on the line though too, who are, you know, political officials, et cetera. We have to, again, be thinking about solutions, you know, and how we can address this systemically.
Thank you, Raja. Any other, Becca, Ibrahim, any additional pieces you want to contribute?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dr. Staggers-Hakim really, you know, took that, you know, in a really deep direction. I think the thing that I would add is, you know, for me, when I think about, when I start to think about all of this, and a lot of this has to do with my own kind of identity, positionality in relation to this work, I think about food as a tool of control, and food as something that can give or take away agency. And so I think that in addition to the real health outcomes that you were speaking to, I also think about, you know, the generational mental burden of knowing that some of the best and most promising practices within agriculture come from the same populations that are most negatively impacted by the food system currently. You know, I think about how do we think about, you know, physiological and psychological health and think about our food system in a way that promotes agency, gives the power back to people, and recognizes what we've lost and what we've stolen in a lot of ways from you know, the large scale corporatization of our food system. And, you know, even things like food access and food security initiatives that happen, right? They, you know, they many times, as well intentioned as they are, can other people, they can't, you know, like they're not about a redistribution of power, they're about a redistribution of food. And so I think about all of the real impacts that Dr. Staggers was talking about and how intricately those are interrelated with issues that I think really do impact psychological and physiological health, which, you know, really do have a lot to do with how much impact do we have and can we have kind of over our own lives, and how much control do we have over something as basic and as elemental as what we eat, when we eat it, how we get it. And, you know, I guess I just paint that on top of, you know, I think these very real ways that that plays out on the ground is that I think I spend a lot of time, you know, thinking about that and gravitating toward work that I think centers those experiences and tries to bring those voices to the center of those conversations.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would only add, I mean, just very, very briefly, because I think the two doctors summed it up quite well. You know, what if we're in the United States, I mean, the idea of choice, you know, for many folks, the choice is limited to a few options, which makes it no choice at all at the end of the day. And so I think talking about the sovereignty and really getting back to being able to allow people to control how and what they eat, it, you know, has so many deep psychological and physiological and biological effects on you that any missing piece of that puzzle is going to be, you're going to see some ramifications of it. I think that they made some great points about that for sure.
Can the panelists speak about, I just wrote a few notes down about access and choice and independence, and speak of the best of what we have here in the Commonwealth that we could do more of. I'm always looking to find the things that are working and trying to do more of that. So from a food access, from food choice, food independence, rather than focusing on food development and distribution. I think you used that word, Doctor. How do you empower people with more choices and access? And I think at the same time, the innovation that I think is here is food that is locally sourced. So I need good nutrition for my family, but I can help the farmer over here because they need a place to distribute their foods too. So how do we connect the local source with the community in a respectful way that breaks down those barriers around labeling that come from a food distribution system that might label people as food insecure, which is what we're trying to get away from?
I mean, I think it's a good question. I guess I'll just weigh in with a couple of quick thoughts because this is something, and listening to you talk earlier, it definitely resonated with, like I said, some of the work I'm doing with the Boston Food Access Council, given that I have, you know, connections with NOFA and specifically Northeast Organic Farming Association in Massachusetts, and also an organization called Red Tomato. And I think it's a difficult question because I think the scale at which the sort of farming that you're talking about happens is not the same scale that is at which, you know, these large scale kind of food access distributors are, you know, sourcing their food. And so I was excited to hear earlier you talking a little bit about trying to make those connections. And I think that, you know, at the end of the day, you know, I think Red Tomato is a good example of an organization that like what's needed is kind of more infrastructure that allows small and mid-sized farms to connect to one another so that they can kind of pool their product and have a place in that marketplace, because there is, you know, government funding, so on and so forth, associated with sourcing food, even for food banks, so on and so forth. And so, you know, I think that you know, there's some opportunity there. I think leveraging networks like NOFA that are connecting with these small scale farmers kind of across the Commonwealth, again, who might be only making, you know, very limited, you know, amounts of product, so on and so forth. I mean, I do think there are some good practices out there for that. And then I think too about, you know, and this is kind of another topic in general, but I know there is a very active gleaning organization here in the Boston area. And I don't know how that kind of looks in other parts of the Commonwealth, but you know, a lot of food is also left in the fields, right? And so if there are opportunities to collect that food, distribute it, you know, there are more options. The other thing that I think a lot of folks are thinking about, and I'd be interested to hear others' thoughts on this as well, is like the pandemic happened at kind of a best case scenario time as far as growing food goes in this part of the country. And so like, what does that look like in the winter? What does it look like to, you know, shorten those supply chains or connect the food more directly to the people that need it in a time of the season here where the food isn't necessarily growing as readily. And so I have more questions than I have answers, but I think the questions that you're asking, I am heartened to hear that those are questions that are being asked from a legislative perspective as well.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, food is a piece of a larger puzzle, right? And if the recent studies that have been released about COVID-19 are correct, one of the most important recommendations that's been made is that the people who are acutely affected by the disease get the most treatment. They get the most salt, they get everything that they would need to help them get better. And I think we need to look at the food system and we need to look at the society in the same way. There are people who have been acutely injured by the things and the choices that government policy has made for many, 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 many decades. And food is just an aspect of this larger puzzle. And those people who are most acutely affected by those things need to be completely and utterly made whole. And so in order for that to happen, the resources that have, in many cases and in certain places, that supposed miraculously appeared out of nowhere to cover the cost of, for instance, like other aspects of our society, like trillions of dollars which is made available. The same thing needs to be happening for people who are going to be acutely affected by the harms that the society have already done to them in many different places around our country. I take California as an example, who are taking the time to look into some of what I'm describing and looking at those who have been acutely affected by some of the policy and things that have happened over the generations. And I think that in and of itself, when you look at those most vulnerable and most hurt by certain policies and things of that nature, then you can really begin to see some semblance of what my good folks who believe in Ronald Reagan and all that kind of stuff, to see that boat rise up. But without really taking, I think, into account the history of what we're trying to deal with, food just becomes another segment that is looked at in a chamber to try to be solved. And I think that we have to begin to think about how we're going to make people whole again.
Yes, and it is very fascinating to also look at, like we spoke of before and throughout this panel, food is interconnected to us in many ways, and looking at how it's advertised to us, the communities in which certain kinds of food products are pushed out versus other kinds of food products, the kinds of access that Raja spoke about that certain communities have and other communities don't have. It creates this puzzle that folks need to really work to unpack, to understand how much needs to be restructured in order for us to improve access and make sure that there's universal access to the same qualities of food and the same types of food that more wealthy populations have and more impoverished populations have, that inner cities have versus suburban areas have versus rural areas. So Lieutenant Governor presents a really great question to us about how can we make sure that access is more widespread so that we can touch more people. But there is a larger question and a larger issue that we need to kind of work on in order for us to truly make sure that access and provision of food has increased equity across the entire country and in the entire globe. So it's a huge question, multifaceted question.
Absolutely. And you know, the other part of this too is it's so important that, and I understand and appreciate the context of the question, because we do have to really appreciate where there is the need. You know, and I think that, you know, part of this conversation is around establishing understanding of the need and the disparity and the inequity so that we can go in and address appropriately. And I think that your response, Felicia, is right on when you talk about equity, to really understand where the needs lie. I can't speak from Massachusetts specifically, Lieutenant Governor, but what I would say though, too, based in my experience, and I go back to the example of Harlem Children's Zone, it was actually a children's obesity initiative. And I love the way that this was actually presented. It was quite comprehensive in terms of the way that this program was structured. I mean, they did the research, they had the data, they looked at, you know, obesity rates in the children who were part of this program. They had several sites, right? So they, of course, dealt with physical activity, but they also really focused on food. They had a kitchen where they worked with local farmers and they prepared food. But not only that, and I think about this in terms of an access issue, in a non-traditional access issue, they literally brought in on Saturdays once a month, and it was not nearly enough, but it was what they could do with their budget. They brought in local farmers, and people would literally go around, and there was no cost to the local residents, and they would pick up fruits and vegetables. And they also had folks who could teach people how to prepare meals and how to store meals that were healthy that they would be able to eat and to enjoy. And I think that part of this too, of course, and I love the question, looking at what works and then enhancing that. So what we're really talking about, increasing that access, understanding the extent of the problem, and making sure that we bring the food to where people are and where there is need. Clearly, when people can't get across town or they have to take a bus to a grocery store, that means that people, and we're also pairing that with income, because we typically would, right? If we're talking about people on a bus going to a grocery store, that clearly means that people are probably going at a time when they have access to finances for food. We can then say that maybe perhaps, and there are lots of studies around this looking at SNAP programs to address food insecurity, right? So once a month, you know, especially if there are transportation issues, people are going and doing a big shop. What does that mean? That means that people are probably packing up on foods that are going to stay long, that have longer storage life. They're not able to go in to freshen up on fruits and vegetables as often. And we also have to speak about this issue though too, and why I love the Harlem Children's Zones program in terms of cost and food density. And we also know that, of course, fresh fruits and vegetables can be more costly. I mean, and then when we're talking about in terms of people being able to replenish it, often doesn't have the shelf life, right? Rice is going to have a longer shelf life. Cereal is going to have a longer shelf life. Processed foods with preservatives are going to have a larger shelf life. There was another study, and forgive me, I'm an academic, but there was a study, it's dated, it's 2004. And I think, Becca, likewise, my dissertation was actually on obesity in African-American women and looking at discrimination. So food insecurity and looking at, you know, segregation. This is part of that work, right? But they found that this study from 2004, Dranowski and Spector, looked at food obesity and food, the cost of food and food density. And what they found though too was that mothers oftentimes, and this happens often, who receive SNAP benefits, obesity is so very much connected to that because people will eat when there's food available.
Mhm.
And then when there's not food available, people are literally starving. So oftentimes we talk about health, we talk about, obesity, for example, we think that people are just overeating. It's actually a nutrition issue, is that people don't have enough food to eat and to eat healthy food over the course of a month, for example. So people may be over consuming when there's food that's available and then kind of storing up, feeding their children what they can, right? Of course, there are other factors though too in terms of not having enough money. So kids may be eating things that provide immediate relief, and excitement, at the time because that's what's available, and not having enough for the rest of the month. So, certainly, we have to look at again this access piece and to, go in when we see a good model, bring it to more places, but really understand where the need is.
I mean, I think some of the innovations around, obviously access to public markets and farmers markets are great, but sometimes that's not within reach from an affordability standpoint. Are there any innovations around growing your own? Whether in a Commonwealth like Massachusetts, there are innovations with home growing your fruits and vegetables.
That was actually a question we're going to switch over to. So thank you, Lieutenant Governor. How would you advise someone who's interested in producing their own?
Well, I mean, when you're talking about producing food, you're talking about land, and more likely than not, right? And so, where are you gonna, and who is gonna provide the space in a city to allow for people to do that? And that's the $1 million question. And I can tell you from speaking with groups from around the state, because we do have a mass food systems kind of group, and people do get together and they do tackle these issues and they do talk about solutions and if you want to find out some solutions to some of the questions that have been asked today so far, that's a good group to begin that inquiry. But and I can tell you from experience, having had 2 parcels of land taken from our organization in the past, that if you can solve what to do or bring back some of the ideas from the past around common spaces, being able to grow food in uncommon places, being able to figure out ways to remediate soils that already exist in places so that the soil can produce healthy food, then you can begin to perhaps answer some of those questions. But let's take, for instance, a city like ours and a city like Boston. In order to grow food, we have most of the things that you need. You have soil, you have sunlight. But if you don't have water, or you don't have the means to collect water, and now in these times, if it doesn't rain as it needs to, but more importantly, if you don't have access to water, you're not going to be successful. And so cities that don't provide access to water for even the most simple community garden are not going to thrive. They're not going to survive. And so as a state kind of policy, it would be great to see how even something as simple as making water available for the spaces that already exist would be a tremendous leap forward. Now, finding space in a town like Hadley for growing food is not a difficult endeavor, although that land for that particular town that I'm talking about is quite expensive. Never mind trying to negotiate a city like Springfield, Boston, or Worcester, where prices for land and are already exorbitant. And so those are the real tangible hurdles that without being able to solve those things, we're in big trouble. Now, there's other alternatives, of course. I mean, for people who might have the means to do some hydroponic growing or to do some vertical growing, that's great. It just doesn't yield the amount of food necessary to really make an impact in most larger communities where the food and the cost of the food needs to be stretched out a little bit. And so I really can only see the land or acquiring land or being able to facilitate two things. What, the training of people, which is a job opportunity for a lot of folks. Training people to be able to steward this land is another piece that would have to be really developed and really financed, because you just can't make the land available, make water available, and just expect people that have the know-how to come in and orchestrate these sorts of endeavors that are very time-consuming, that require a lot of energy and work and planning. And so, a lot of things that could be beneficial to our economy, to how we grow food and whatnot, could be solved by just really investing heavily in these communities and making these things happen.
Yeah, and I think a good example of that, just quickly, is that, and I think, you're spot on with everything you say there. And I think one of the things that I would just say that I think is an exemplar of what you're talking about is, there are 2.7 million plus farm workers in this country, and they are one of the sectors of workers that experience some of the highest rates of hunger. They know how to farm. That's literally what they do. And so it's the, how do we value that knowledge, that expertise? How do we have access to land and not simply create a system where we're relying on the exploitation of certain groups of people, and so it's you're asking I think a big question, but again, I just give that as one example of what I think Ibrahim is saying, is that it's not a matter of know-how necessarily. It's a matter of disconnection between the know-how and the means. And I think there is a role in the political process to beginning to bring those things together, for sure.
Definitely. As we see within this hour that we've been communicating, we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more that we could unpack. And if we have an opportunity to continue this conversation, I would love for us to have like a part 2. So definitely let's think about seeing if there's an opportunity that can exist for us to be able to continue and dive even deeper, because there are a lot of layers, as I mentioned before, and that we have been alluding to over the course of this hour, that is connected to this conversation about the food that we eat, the access to that food, the provision of that food, and all the related factors. I would definitely love to thank you, the three of you. This has been an amazing conversation. I imagine that everyone in the audience has taken away a nugget that they're now able to walk back to their respective environments and ponder over and think about what they're eating the next time that they pick up something from their kitchens. Josh, could you check the board to see if there's any questions to share with our panelists before we wrap up?
Of course, there's one comment made that I think lends itself to a question, actually, is Mary asked, why are we still unable to purchase hot food with SNAP when so many people may not have a working stove or be living in or reside in temporary housing? Does anybody have a response to that, or I guess I would also phrase it as, does anybody have any examples of initiatives that are underway to maybe work around the fact that you cannot purchase that hot food with SNAP benefits?
I would really like to get an answer to that myself personally. I could see maybe some legal liability issues around that, but honestly, I don't see, somebody, if you could provide an answer, one of the two other folks, I would love to hear a response to that.
I would recommend a book that's called Big Hunger. I don't know if folks have read that, but I would definitely recommend it. It's by it came out through MIT Press, and the name of the author is Andrew Weil, I think. In that piece, I think he would make the argument, at least this author would, that the answer to that question is because that would not benefit large food corporations to be able to, for SNAP recipients to be able to purchase prepared and hot foods. And so the interconnection between large corporations and how much control they have in our food system and I think governmental decisions and policy decisions about how benefits are, put out, are definitely interlinked. And so it's not my area of expertise, but as someone who's curious about similar things, that is a resource I would certainly recommend.
I don't have a direct answer to that question either, but I kind of want to piggyback on what was said. And I think that, Dr. Berkey, you mentioned this too in terms of food and control, right? I think that we do have, part of that question, I think we have to speak about how SNAP programs are often attacked. Whether we probably going back, some years ago, there were probably suggestions that people who were receiving SNAP could buy or could not buy certain foods. And then of course, certain grocery stores prior to that would not take SNAP. At some times or two. So I think that's a larger policy issue on one hand in terms of, who's receiving the funds for this. But I think also in terms of people who are disenfranchised, part of disenfranchising people are left out of policy decisions. But this is a huge policy piece in terms of how SNAP can benefit the people who rely and need these services. So I think this raises a huge question. I mean, oftentimes this is one of those loopholes. Once again, it's like, people who are living in low-income conditions who may qualify for SNAP, they may not have the other resources to prepare the food that they need to be able to survive. So these are things that I think need to be lifted and raised to policy level so that there's an awareness and there's an emphasis on this need for this to be, the reallocation of SNAP and how different foods can qualify for that.
I think we have all the questions that were submitted for today. Again, I would like to thank the three of you for leading us in this amazing conversation. As I said, this is only scratching the surface. There's so many other places that we can go. So if y'all are amenable, I would love to have like a part 2 at a later date. So be on the lookout for further conversations about this. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for today's STEM event called Know Where Your Food Comes From. Tomorrow, we have our 3rd live STEM Week event with a panel presentation called STEM Career Symposium hosted by STEM Starter Academy. And Friday, 11:15 a.m., we have our final live STEM Week event featuring Dell employees who will talk about their experiences with the company. Thank you all for your afternoon. Don't forget to fill out the survey that was dropped in the chat and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Springfield Technical Community College, STCC.